why I'm running is because we have a status quo in Beacon Hill that's not matching the urgency of the moment, not on racial justice, not on climate change, not on the economy. And economic relief is needed now more than ever. So the status quo is not something I'm going to just accept, and neither should voters in my district, and that's why I'm running. A lot. The Massachusetts State House is broken. And the core problems I see, there are three problems, but two are really endemic to the State House. And that is a lack of transparency and a concentration of power in leadership. There's a third broader problem throughout all of Massachusetts politics, and that is we have uncompetitive elections, and there are bigger reasons for that we can talk about. But for the State House specifically, it starts with transparency. Ultimately, there are too many good bills that are killed with a secret vote mechanism to hold state reps accountable. Right now, there's a lot of reps who give lip service by co-sponsoring bills, but at the same time voting in secret to kill them. And that link between having it both ways has got to be cut. And the way to cut that is through publishing committee roll call votes, publishing committee hearings, and publishing everything that we can, modernizing this legislature to be as transparent as other states have. It's something we can do. The second issue, though, is related to transparency. It's concentration of power. In the U.S. Congress, everyone is paid the same amount except the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and the Majority Leader. But in our legislature, especially after the recent Pay Reform Act, there are stipend systems that allow House leadership to essentially control, with a significant share of the income, how state reps are slotted in terms of committee chairs, committee vice chairs, and leadership. And this power system where only a few stakeholders get to make decisions on whether bills move forward or not is a huge bottleneck to progressive legislation. It's really the ambition, right? The cadence of legislation, typically every session is like, do everything the last 5 weeks, which that was a bad idea even before coronavirus, and now it's a travesty in 2020. So that cadence of legislation of being so slow and lacking ambition, that's because there's a tremendous concentration of power at the top. So we have to start improving transparency, and I applaud Act on Mass for providing leadership on that issue. But once we get good progressive reps in the State House, they also have to change the State House culture. So it's not so much a top-down hierarchical institution, and that will begin to really, I think, increase our progress in passing these bills that have languished for years. Yes, I really was captivated by Mass Inc.'s report last November. It's called the Mass Forward Report, and just a great piece of research. And they identify a number of problems why we have such uncompetitive elections. One issue is we don't have synchronized elections. That's often moved to the late summer, like it is this year, and that late summer primary drives low turnout, which protects incumbents, and high incumbency re-election rates deter challengers, right? So that is one issue, synchronizing our elections. Our campaign finance system is really screwed up, and we have to do a lot better and ultimately get to public funding of elections. That's the end goal, to really democratize and let everyone be able to run for office. But beyond those two issues, I think there's a broader problem where we're a very democratic, blue state. And some people naively think that means we're progressive, but that's not the case. That's not. Because we're 80% Democratic in the House and 90% Democratic in the Senate, the real bottleneck then becomes these intra-party disputes, and it's harder for voters to be able to learn the signal of who's really a progressive Democrat versus a kind of status quo machine Democrat. And there are way too many of the latter, and they are what I like to call faux-gressives, again, giving service to these ideals that we share about social economic justice. They give lip service to those issues, but they like the system where they can just sign on to those ideas but never have to vote for them. They don't have to take any action. And so it's a system plagued by inertia and complacency. And so because they're able to have it both ways, voters are never able to hold their reps accountable because there's never a verifiable instance of, here's my rep who says they're progressive on immigration, yet they voted against the Safe Communities Act. There's never that link. So the legislators just coast from one election to the next, and potential challengers shrug their shoulders and say, why bother? It's an uphill battle to raise money to fight a summer campaign with low turnout. But I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to challenge the status quo. And it starts one seat at a time. If we can get to 16 reps to get roll calls, we can start to wreak havoc. We can start to really, push for radical change at the State House. Yes, the rules matter, but ultimately it's going to be a culture change. I really follow Rebecca Rausch, Senator Rebecca Rausch's example here. She, in the Senate, again, I'm running for the House, but in the Senate, she has been, I think, outstanding as a leader and sometimes joining with Republicans at the start of her tenure to stand for roll calls as a matter of principle. That's how I would like to see it, because to take a step back, I spoke with Representative Jonathan Hecht. He's retiring. He will be a former rep. And we were talking about how historically past speakers in the 80s and 90s, speakers like Kavarian and Finneran, these are speakers who had a reputation for having an iron-fisted control over the House. Yet, when you look at the amount of hours the House was in session, sometimes it was, nowadays the House is in session just one day a week. The amount of debate that happens in the House, on the House floor, is so much less than it was even a few decades ago. So when I think about what's the principle, to emulate Rebecca Rausch and stand for roll call votes all the time, I think it's because we need to change the culture of doing things behind the scenes and orchestrating votes. And so that, currently it's just a formality. The leadership has whipped the vote that they want. They sell it as consensus, but really it's the least common denominator to, have a chummy relationship with a Republican governor and get, unanimous votes through the House. You can't govern by unanimity. You can't govern by unanimous votes. You have to be willing to push the envelope and make people uncomfortable. So ultimately, to answer your question, I would stand for roll call votes out of principle, unless it was just, I can't envision, unless it's just an egregious, conservative bill that is, filled with bigotry. But maybe in that case, I wouldn't even want to have a floor vote on it, and I wouldn't stand for it. But even if it's something that I disagree with, I would want to stand for a roll call vote. It is a tough problem, but again, it goes back to this relationships or values. Which do you value? Which do you put first? I will put the values first in terms of whether it's the Roe Act, the Safe Communities Act, or just the general principle, right, of transparency rules reform that force those major progressive bills to go for a vote. That principle, if it pisses off the powers that be such that they dangle over my head earmark cuts for the district, I think there's two ways to respond. One directly and forcefully, and one more collaboratively. The collaborative way, I'll start there, the kind of play nice is being a good colleague when it comes to other legislation. And how can I do that? In other words, I can be able to make a deal with House leadership and say, look, there are some line in the sand issues you're going to be pissed at me about, but on many other issues, I'm going to be a productive colleague. Why? How am I going to be different than my opponent in this race? Is that I have some outside expertise, right? So as an economist, and everyone in the State House, almost everyone, is short on staff. They're short on expertise and time. Well, I have a lot of a technical background when it comes to jobs and budgets and finance, and I would partner with, say, Maria Robinson, someone who has an energy climate change background. I could partner with a lawyer, an attorney, and we could work together on electric vehicle charging stations or something. And I'm using that just as a hypothetical example of you can engender goodwill even among leadership by being a productive colleague in shaping legislation. That's how you play nice to say, hey, on many issues I'll work with you. I'll play ball. We can be pragmatic about how you design solar credits in the SMART program. That's a technical issue. But on other issues, I'm not going to be a wheeler dealer. I want to stand for the roll call votes because that's a principle. That's the play nice strategy. The play, I don't want to say it's confrontational, but it's assertive, is to highlight how leadership is exposing your constituents to budget harm. Because if you're going to go nuclear on the district and say, you need this, and I know you need it, but I'm not going to give it to you out of pettiness, then there's a huge way that can backfire for leadership, and that's to go public. And if you're going to have this fight, let's have this fight. And this is where, again, I don't want to say I'm confrontational, I'm going to throw rocks, but I am going to be assertive. If you push back on my district, I'm going to go public with that in a way that has consequences. And so the reason I raise that as a threat, and I mentioned this to people who are like, you got to play nice, otherwise we're not going to get, this pothole fix. When I explained that you can actually use that tool to get attention, if you're ever threatened of budget cuts to get attention for your district and show how House leadership is being callous, they realize, oh yeah, that would be bad for the speaker. But that exact mechanism shows why this whole threat rarely is enforced. That's why I think it's almost kind of a mythic beast. When I talk to current or former state reps, the ones that are progressives who stood up for these role changes, and I look at the earmarks, I look at the budget, the state aid allotments, I don't see any big, retribution. I think a lot of that is a myth, and it's a way to kind of keep people in line as a kind of a myth, a sort of Damocles that hangs over our heads, and we're like, oh, I got to fall in line. I think you'll never get substantive change until you push the limit.